Hello, everyone. This is Shin, and I am recording a lecture that we basically had to cancel because I was sick. So this is a substitute recording class. So thank you for watching this chapter. And we're going to keep learning chapter 3. And this is basically going to be the third lecture on chapter 3. So in case you're wondering where this fits in. So now in this lecture video, we're going to talk about the third section. We're going to start talking about the third section of chapter 3, in which we're going to go through different studies of social psychology of leisure, looking at their specific focus on their different research methods, the tools that we want you to know so that you can use them in the future, maybe as our professionals, or maybe you know where the evidence that you're reading and using are coming from. And this slide provides a glance and overview of all the methods that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So there's quite a bit actually, but this way, this is going to be the entire toolkit that you have, and you can make an informed decision as to, when you have to do program evaluation, which is the best method, for example. Now you realize at the very top, post-positivism, constructivism, they're the two paradigms that we talked about, research paradigms, different assumptions, right? That leads to different types of data and research methods. Quantitative, based on the numbers typically, qualitatives based on not numbers, like compositions and whatnot. So we're going to go one by one. First being experimental methods. Now, we say experiments and experimental methods and whatnot, but not everything, let's say, happens in research lab, room, doesn't necessarily become experiments. What constitutes experiments is actually different things. There's actually principles. So the chapter, along with their more advanced reading, they specify 5 principles that make research method experimental. So especially the top 2, the red one, are very, very important. The first is the random assignment of the causal or independent variable. For example, treatment versus placebo, okay? Treatment, let's say we have a new recreation therapy treatment based on this, whatever the new activity, it's a board game or is it whatever that it might be, okay? And the placebo group can be, well, nothing, like doing nothing at all, or it could be just a more traditional, whatever the traditional activity-based treatment, okay? So when we get the people to participate in this, our research, if this is experimental, we have to randomly assign those people. Let's say we get 50 people, 25 people randomly chosen will go to new treatment. The other 25 randomly chosen will go to placebo. The key here is that people, the participants, do not get to choose which group to go to. Why? Why do you think that might be? There are many reasons, but one of the biggest one is that if we let people choose their groups, that could create some baseline biased groups. For example, right? Some people who are quote unquote more desperate and they're having really dire health situation, having chronic issue for a long time, something they tried all the different treatments and methods and they're nothing worked. So those people might go to, although it's less likely in a non-medical field like ours, but still might try to do the new treatment, in this case, new treatment, whatever, based on the board game or, coloring or whatever, right? Because nothing else really worked. The people who are not so bad may choose placebo or traditional group or whatever, okay? So the baseline could be very different. Treatment group may have more biased, poorer health, worse health condition to begin with, because those people kind of go to the new technique, new treatment. And from there, maybe treatment group improved quite a bit too. Placebo group may improve quite a little bit too. And the result is treatment group is still worse, although they may have improved quite a bit too, because the baseline, the group is basically grouping was biased, and in the baseline health status, whatever that is, was pretty poor to begin with because those people chose the new treatment, something like that. So random assignment is very, very important. Second principle is manipulation and controlling of extraneous factors. Extraneous factors are other possible causes. Okay, so let's say our causes are new treatment and the placebo group. We have a control group, placebo group, and we're looking at their impact on, let's say, mental health, anxiety, right? We have to make sure by second principle, what that means is that everything else that can impact anxiety, the outcome we're looking at, should be same between the two groups, because otherwise we don't know whether it was a treatment that made the impact, or it might have been something else, environmental factors, social factors, personal factors. For example, if the treatment group received treatment in a very beautiful, pleasant, relaxing environment, right? So they spend a lot of time in there over, multiple days and multiple weeks. Placebo group had to wait in a very boring, even actually not pleasant room. That could actually negatively impact their health, right? So we don't know. So that environment was not extraneous factor. The room condition wasn't controlled or manipulated between the two groups. So what's going to happen is that even though we detected some changes in the outcome improvement for the treatment group, let's say, we don't know it was because of the treatment or because of the environment, for example. Third principle, talking about measurement of the effects. So obviously we have to measure outcome dependent variable. For example, in our case, anxiety level. We have to measure that. We have to measure that in a valid and reliable way. Fourth, we have to have a reasonable theory that explains underlying mechanism. So let's say, yes, this treatment group seems to report a lower level of the anxiety after treatment, right? Great, but why? How? How is this treatment is impacting anxiety? What's the mechanism? Neurological, psychological, whatever. There has to be some theory to explain that. And then fifth, reasonable time lapse between the cause and effect. What that means is that, for example, for any activity treatment for the treatment to work on, let's say, anxiety, which is pretty, instant, probably after 30 minutes and 1 hour of activity, there may be some visible changes, but probably not after like 5 seconds. So if you try to measure, anxiety level right after, that's not probably a good idea. Maybe even like 1 or 2 minutes, it's too short, right? So there has to be some time lapse between going through that treatment or the causal variable, independent variable, whatever that might be, and when that changes, expected changes in outcome will happen. Okay, there has to be time gap between them, reasonable one. Now, what are the advantages of the experiment? The biggest one is this. It's the most convincing way to support, indicate causality, that A causes B, which is different from what's called correlation. Okay, correlation is A is correlated to B, which means A goes up, then B also goes up, or B goes down, whatever that is. This is just causal correlation. Okay, there's no directionality between two. You don't know A is causing B or B is causing A, or we don't know. But with the experimental method, we would know the causal or independent variable is or isn't affecting the outcome variable B. Okay, so this is a really important characteristic. Now, there are some disadvantages too. Now, one of the disadvantages is limited generalizability, because especially for lab experiments done in the controlled environments room, right? Because a lot of leisure recreation activity experiences do not happen in this kind of controlled environment. So what we observed here in the room may not be generalizable to outside. There's also difficulty in replicating leisure experiences in the lab environment too, though. For example, we want to make children feel free and relaxed and enjoyable in the lab experiment context, because that's what we are interested in. It is actually not that easy, right? If it's, let's say outside, if it's a playground, it would be probably easy to do that, to let children feel that way. So there's that issue around actually can we make leisure activity and experiences in lab. Also, another issue is called underdetermination of theory, which means that, you know, the force principle that you have, force, yeah, you got to have a theory that explains why the cause is actually causing the effective outcome, right? Let's say why treatment is causing reduction in anxiety. Why? There's an explanation you have. But typically there are multiple explanations. There's a neuropsychological explanation, there's a psychological explanation, there are multiple psychological explanations sometimes, there's a sociological explanation, all that kind of competing theories. And then we don't necessarily know that. Typically, you know, we don't know which theory really fits, really explains the situation. So there's always possibility that the explanation you have may not be the reason why. Now, the chapter talked about experiment quite a bit too, and it's very important. The reason why they talked about it so much is because it's about causality. It's very powerful tool. But the chapter also mentioned, based on this Gary Ellis's and colleagues' review of the papers in the Leisure Sciences and Journal of Leisure Research. So those are the two top journals in the field of social psychology of leisure, in the field of leisure studies in general. Over the 278 articles published between 2008 and 2012, based on their review over that 5 years period, only 2 articles, 2 studies used experimental methods. Why? Well, because of those disadvantages that we just talked about to an extent too. Okay, so it's underutilized these days. Now, a little bit of a caveat though. Outside of these journals, these are general leisure studies journals, general, like about leisure. But there are some journals about therapeutic recreation therapy, Therapeutic Recreation Journal, TRJ, American Journal of Recreation Therapy, so on and so forth. Those journals tend to have more experimental design because there's some more clinical research in there. Now, here's an example. Actually, because we just recently, our research team just conducted an experimental study of how what's called online leisure education intervention. So what that is online. So it's like a Moodle, it's like e-class, right? It's like online course in a way, where we provided all the information sharing, like YouTube video on the right side. You can see, yes, I did not enjoy this video shooting at all. Stressful. Anywho, learning about the importance of leisure, different leisure, opportunities existing on a campus, in a city, so on and so forth, doing some reflection, discussions, online discussions, whatnot, how that potentially helps students, university students, U of A students, leisure life, and mental health. We actually conducted this experiment, so it's online. So technology is really helping that we don't necessarily have to have a lab like a physical space. We could potentially use virtual space as the new experiment lab that we can control to an extent, okay? And we actually observed that this 8-week program can improve people's leisure experiences and their participation, as well as help with their mental health as well. So that's an exciting thing, and it's really help with the causal implications. Causality is a key. Now the chapter talked about subcategories, subtypes of experiments. And one of them is obviously, we talked about lab experiments, laboratory experiments, which we don't do a lot these days. But anyway, Manel's study is one of the classic one. Roger Manel, retired university from Waterloo, page 75 to 79. I really want you to read this part. And you can see how thoughtful researchers can be when they craft up devise this experiment to really narrow, answer specifically the question that they want to answer. In the case of Roger Manel here, his goal was to examine whether perceived freedom and perceived competitiveness affected people's experience of flow. Now, in a parenthesis here, I have ER, -R. What that means is that there are 4 types of definition categories we learned, right? E stands for experience and research. R stands for researcher, experience, researcher approach. And you don't have to know this name, but what that means is that experience. So it's a subjective approach. It's focused on a subjective type of leisure phenomena. Why? There's a perceived freedom. There's a flow. Those are subjective experiences, right? Researcher approach means that external vantage point, which means that the researchers chose what counts as a leisure. Flow experience, for example, counts as a leisure. Perceived freedom counts as a leisure. That's Menel, this researcher, decided, not the participants. Okay, so therefore, ER approach. You don't have to know that ER, but you have to know external vantage point, subjective phenomena, so on and so forth. Now, he created 5-minute fake learning experiments. Whatever, there's like a learning, new technique or experiment, tool or whatever, game or something. Now, that was a fake, but the research was advertised as saying, yes, this is a experiment about new learning technique, whatever, and you're going to do that after waiting some time anyway. And the researcher took away the watches for that time being, like you cannot have your watches with you because that's going to interfere with the device we're going to use in a learning experiment, which wasn't the truth actually, but they had to take the watches away. You will know later. And then each participant had to spend 30 minutes in the waiting room. Everybody spent 30 minutes. And that was actually real experiment. People didn't know, students didn't know. Now, Roger Menel had two causal variable, independent variable in his mind. One is perceived freedom, the other one is perceived competitiveness. Now, for perceived freedom, we had to have 2 groups, basically, of the students. One group, when they entered a waiting room, they were told, hey, while you're spending waiting in this room, you get to choose an activity game you can do. A or B in a box. You can't see the inside. Which one do you want to choose? Right? It's your choice. So that the student felt that they had a choice. Okay? Felt that they had a choice. Felt, that's the key. Now the other group, no, they were just given an activity, game, right? Oh, you can do this while waiting. Now, the tricky part is that the first group, they thought that they get to choose one of the 2 games. They were actually not choosing. The game in the A or B boxes, they were same activity, same game. So they were not actually choosing. There was no choice, but they had the perception of the choice, perception of freedom. Now, why? Why didn't Menel provide 2 different games for those students? Think about the 5 principles of the experiments we talked about, especially around the manipulation of extraneous factor. If some of the students in the first group actually played the different games, wouldn't that be an extraneous factor? Wouldn't that be another reason besides perceived freedom and competitiveness? Wouldn't that be another additional causal variable factor that can impact people's flow experience, right? Different types of games. That's very important. Now, for the perceived competitiveness, one group of students were told that their gaming results can be compared with other people. So, do your best maybe. So that's competitiveness is there. For the other group, nothing was told. In terms of the effect, the result outcome, right? Which is flow here. But once again, flow is observable or unobservable. It's not really observable. It's unobservable, right? So Roger Menel tried to measure what's called absorption, how absorbed students are into the activity. That's what he was trying to measure. If you remember RLS 100, absorption is one of the characteristics of flow, actually. Now, to further operationalize or operationally define absorption, what he did, Roger Menel did, was he did 2 things, 2 ways to measure absorption. One is time perception, and you can really see what he did by looking at their, reading the chapter. So go to the figure 3.3a, please. That's going to help you much better here. So in that, you should see basically a line. Okay, a line represents, it's like a survey. Line represents the time that students spend in the learning activity, which was 5 minutes after the waiting room, right? 5 minutes. And the questionnaire, that question asked, okay, right below that, please draw a line that represents amount of time that you think you spend in the waiting room compared to that line that representing the 5 minutes that they spend in the learning activity. Now, technically they spend 30 minutes, so the line should be 6 times longer. But if they feel like they were having flow, a lot of flow, they feel like time was passing fast or whatever, and they feel like, like twice long. So they felt like, they spent 10 minutes or something, right? So that line, and then they measure actually, Roger Minell measure the line actually, and then put it into numeric variable. Another one is attention to the room. The reasoning here is that if the student was absorbed in the activity, then they would be paying less attention to the room, right? So have less memory of the room. So there was some quiz basically about the room characteristics. Now, the participants who are in a high freedom and high competitiveness group, they had a lot of flow, deep flow, and they felt like they spent 10 minutes in that waiting room. And although actuality, in reality, they spend 30 minutes. So you see how experiments are designed very carefully, some tricks in there. Sometimes there's a deception, to be honest. But these days, if we want to do these kind of experiments, we have to actually debrief participants later. After the experiment is over, we have to let them know the real purposes and some of the quote unquote deception that they used and the reason why. And the deception is only okay when it's actually, scientifically important. Now you can see why the researcher took the watches away, because if they could actually measure 30 minutes in a waiting room, right? And then 5 minutes in a learning activity, they can try to draw like 6 times longer line, but that's not what they wanted students to do. They wanted to measure the perception, time perception, the feelings of time passage. So they need to take that out. Sometimes there's a lot of thoughts go into good experiments. The second subtype of experiment is thought experiments, like thinking. This means that we're presenting participants with hypothetical scenarios and ask them to imagine they're in those situations. And we measure how they would think, feel, and behave in those situations. Now, the strength here is that it's inexpensive, it's cheap way to study difficult situation to actually create, right? The problem here is that it's simulated. So it's a hypothetical, it's imaginatory. So the results, whatever the findings, needs to be corroborated. It needs to be supported and tested by the real world observations. Now, this is an example of the thought experiment. Gui and colleagues, and yes, Gui is my wife, by the way. They presented basically leisure situation, leisure scenarios, a short paragraph made by Chinese students. Some of them are made by Canadian students. Okay, so these are actually Chinese students in China, Canadian students in Canada. Okay, and we actually had another set of Chinese and Canadian students, both in China and Canada, respectively. And it was survey, and the Chinese students, for example, some Chinese students read Chinese-made leisure scenarios. Some Chinese students read Canadian-made leisure scenarios, and they were asked to think about whether they consider those situations as leisure or not, and what kind of emotion they would feel. Same thing happened with the Canadian students. They went through, some of them went through Chinese-made, some of them went through Canadian-made leisure scenarios. This is an EP approach, as an experienced participant approach, important. Because we're talking about emotions, it's subjective, right? Experience. P, participants, because it's internal vantage point. We're asking people to determine whether such scenarios are leisure or not, their understanding of leisure, right? Now, this represents benefits of the thought experiments, because if we want to do this in a real world, we would have to bring those Chinese students, for example, from China to here, and then let them experience Canadian leisure, and to ask whether that feels like leisure or not, what kind of emotion they're feeling. It's better, I guess, but it would be a lot more expensive, like hundreds of thousands of dollars more expensive, because we have to take Canadian students to China. Probably students would enjoy that, but it's a lot of money for us, right? But thought experiments would help. It can be a good step toward such experiments too. It's very helpful in a cross-cultural context, because cross-cultural research like this can be very, very expensive. Now, the last type of the experiment that the chapter talked about is field experiments. Now, this is direct contrast to lab experiments, because this one is happening outside of lab, typically outdoor, right? In an actual field where the activity, whatever the activity we're studying, naturally takes place. For example, Bitarso and colleagues exposed a group of cross-country skiers to a snowmobile in the picture, while comparison group was not exposed to snowmobile, to see if encountering a snowmobile impacted their emotions during leisure. Guess what? It does. It actually negatively impact, because you're skiers, you want to enjoy the snow, you want to enjoy the quietness, but then there goes snowmobile, whoom, with our, splash of snows, and disturbs that, fresh, pristine, powder snow, basically. This is an experience researcher approach in a way that, we're talking about emotions. So that's a subjective aspect of leisure. And a researcher, it's an external vantage point, right? Those emotions are already predetermined by researcher, okay? Now, obviously the benefit here is that findings are going to be very much applicable and relevant to the practice. For example, people who are managing, ski resort or, those areas, if they realize that, yes, encountering snowmobile, significantly make emotional experiences negative among cross-country skiers, then they're going to separate them, wouldn't they? So that there's no encountering happen, because they want to improve emotional experiences and satisfactions and whatnot, right? It's very usable, hands-on, applicable knowledge can be produced by field experiments, but there's going to be quite limited control over some extraneous factors. Remember the second principle of experiment. Think about it. What would be an extraneous factor that is difficult to control in this context? Mountain, snowing, skiing, whatnot. One of the good example here is weather. Let's say we cannot do this experiment over one day, right? We have to do it over 1 week. Then some days we may have good weather. Other days we may have actually bad weather. So the good weather obviously positively impact emotions, bad weather negatively impact emotions. So we don't know whether whatever the changes we observed was purely because of the encountering snowmobile, or it was confounded, it was contaminated by the impacts of weather. So it gets more complicated outside the lab. Now, I want you to do this activity on your own, actually. Sorry, this is a video recorded lecture. You don't have your classmates. And we're going to do work on this at the beginning of the next class too. Okay, so I want you to help me design an experimental study while describing how you would meet all of the 5 principles of the experiment, okay? So what I want to do is I want to conduct a lab experiment. Specifically, I'm interested in learning how a sense of competence, being good at something, and relatedness, feeling connected to other people, can impact children's satisfaction or enjoyment of play, let's say, right? I have a lab room or maybe 2 rooms, some leisure equipment like games, toys, and whatnot, research team assistants and as well, and some money. So how would you make an experiment? What kind of experiment can you make so that we can actually test how sense of competence and relatedness can impact children's satisfaction? By principle, go back and design, describe, write down how you would run that experiment. And let's share that next class, okay? This is actually very important. And maybe I could ask some questions in exam too. So let's work on that. Now, the chapter also talked about some non-experimental methods. Again, experimental method is great with the causality. Non-experiment does not help us with the causality. We may know A is causing with the B, A is correlated to B, A is related to B, but we don't know which one is causing which, okay? But these can be non-experimental methods has also its own merits and strengths. So that's what we're gonna learn. One of the most frequently used, actually the most frequently used non-experimental method is survey in the social psychology of leisure, okay? There's some inventory list of questions and activities related to leisure behavior, how often they participate in those things. You already see Rahib's inventory of recreation activity earlier in the last class, in-person class Friday. You can see that on page 82 if you wanna. There are also survey questions about subjective aspect of leisure, such as leisure satisfaction scale. People have to think, it's about people's cognitive evaluation of leisure life. Now here's Rahib's list again, okay? Now let's take a deeper look at it this time. Can you find any potential problem? This one was developed in 1980. You were not born, I'm assuming. Most of you, probably. I was not even born. So different times, sometimes that creates a problem. For example, left top under mass media category. You realize there's no mention of, let's say, video gaming and whatnot, nor social media, which is very common these days, right? So you immediately think like, that could be a problem. That could be a missing piece, right? So using this scale, this list may not help you, may give you some, incomplete idea of people's leisure recreation behavior. Look at this second category, sports activities. There's a bunch of activity, physical exercises like fitness, team sports, individual sports, dual sports, whatnot. And there's this spectating at the sports event, like watching sports events. Are they actually the same thing? Should they be grouped up in the same category? Or maybe spectator sports is somewhere else, like cultural event, maybe. We have to be careful about, how the, surveys are up to date, relevant to the population, the group of people you're studying, and how categorization is done, whether categorization makes sense or not. Now, this is a personal reflection moment. I want you to pause a little bit. Since we just went through the Rahib's list of leisure activity across 6 categories, which category did you engage in this week, over the past 1 week? Now, did you check off all 6 categories? Maybe 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, maybe? Now, do you see any variety in your leisure life? Research shows that having repertoire and variety in a leisure life is a good thing. It helps with your well-being too. Now, do you want to expand your leisure life? Something to think about. Now, here's an example of non-experimental methods specific survey. We're going back to the 2017 Albertan recreation survey with almost 3,000 people. That's a big, well, the biggest probably recreation survey done in Alberta. Now, once again, watching TV is the most frequently participated activity by 95% of Albertans over the past 12 months. So yeah, 95% makes sense. I'm surprised it's not 100% actually. And you can go down the list. Now look at the number 6 though. Playing a video game, computer, electronic games, 56%. Now this shows that how using Rahib's your list of activity wouldn't give us a complete picture of leisure recreation activity life in Alberta, right? It wouldn't, and probably it's going to be problematic everywhere because gaming is a big part of the leisure life, especially maybe after pandemic. So this one, the category, so that this survey also categorized different activities, and there are active living, creative cultural category, land-based activity categories, water-based activity category. Now that's, I don't know, how do you think about this, category though? There's swimming, then fishing, motorboating, canoeing, kayaking. Do you see these activities similarly, or are they different things to an extent? Especially fishing seems to be odd a little bit too, but maybe that's just me. Snow-based activity, obviously important in Alberta, Canada. Facility-based activity, swimming, trampoline, ice hockey, soccer, and there's a bowling. So that's a little bit odd for me. Maybe bowling is actually quite active activity, but it doesn't look that way. Anyway, outdoor facility-based activity. Now this one is also a little bit of strange. Golf, downhill ski, shooting, and snowboarding makes sense. But then there's softball and baseball, which is like more, it's inside a city typically, right? Golf is like a little bit of more, I wouldn't say wilderness, but it's, surrounded by woods and it's more nature. So that's the same thing. Indoor facility-based activity like badminton, and then finally, other activity. Now this one, other, like a miscellaneous, is almost always problematic. So I want you to remember that, because look at this. Watching TV is right there. First of all, this is number one activity. It's right here in the other category. So that's a problem. And then that's in the same category as, let's say, theme park, visiting theme park, or learning at the very bottom. Are they actually the same? Do they belong to the same category? Right? The always miscellaneous category is problematic. It's basically, we don't really know what that represents. Now, what are the advantages of survey? Usually, it takes less time and it's inexpensive to implement. Okay, especially with the online survey technology coming up, it's cheap too, Ferry. I mean, you have to still pay quite a bit of money depending on who you want to survey with, but it's cheaper than actually sending people. There's quite a bit of flexibility as well, that we can update the list of activities, change them a little bit based on a group of people you want to survey. It can be used with the large samples. Sometimes it's thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. You can't do experiment with the thousands of people. That's difficult. Disadvantages and challenges. Sometimes when you actually customize your survey questions too much, there's incomparability. You can't compare the same results across different studies and surveys. Always there's an issue of how many activities are enough from this perspective, though, survey perspective and recreation perspective. Rahib's list had 41 actual activities, but is that enough? New activities and whatnot. But then if the survey gets longer and longer, people started to get, checked out and disengaged. You don't want to have that. So always there's the balance between conciseness and comprehensiveness. How do we categorize those activities, right? Always categorization can be tricky. Emerging activity, new activity, like social media, gaming, whatnot, are they represented? We make sure that we're on top of that, trends in the market, and we will represent that in our surveys. Memory bias is a big, big issue, because in a survey, typically, we ask people to reflect back, like whether it's the 1 week or that day or 1 month or 1 year for that matter. Now, when the time lapse more, there's a more time gap, then, there's a memory biases creep in. Like, how often did you jog this year? You actually maybe jogged for only 5 times, but you maybe feel like, yeah, you know what? I feel like I jogged like 15 times. Like, I think I was active. Maybe I have that positive memory bias, right? And then finally, problematic response patterns, like what's called a straight lining is like, let's say, how often did you do these activity? 1 to 5, 1 being never, 5 all the time, very often, right? People go like 5, or 3, which doesn't represent their reality, but just like easy way for them to finish survey, especially when the survey is longer. So I guess I'm going to stop right here. That's about 40 minutes, and I didn't want to take 15 minutes full. I want you to think about some of the activities, and we can share the results and work further on those activities in the next class. Thank you for watching the video, and I will see you next week.